Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be talking today about the key considerations for compensation chair succession and transition. And joining me, who's an expert in this particular topic, is Michael Brittian, who's a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Michael.
Good morning, TK. Thanks for having me.
Well, on a previous show, we did this exact same discussion, only with the audit chair. Okay, so now we're talking about the compensation chair. And the similarities in that is that the compensation chair requires that knowledge of having some familiarity with compensation, the programs that are executive compensation, long-term, short-term, all that. In addition to that, maybe more than the audit committee, is the chairman of the comp committee may have to speak to investors because no one wants to hear about executive compensation from the CEO themselves or even from HR. They want to hear from the head of the comp committee. So when you're putting all of those requirements together, and it's time to bring either new people on the board or make sure that you have a successor, talk a little bit about what people need to think about prior to the succession part of this, what we're going to talk about.
Sure, TK. Well, you know, I definitely think it starts with the recruitment and the criteria that the board sets out for bringing in new directors. And I think we all know, you know, some of the basic tenets of, you know, the experience that most boards are looking for. And I think it starts with things like, you know, industry experience and experience in finance and leadership and strategy development. And I don't think it's a surprise that all of those things are essential for a really effective compensation committee member or comp committee chair, especially when you think about the perspective of the committee chair and member and their responsibility in terms of identifying and approving performance metrics and stretch targets that are aligned with the company's business strategy and performance objectives, and over time ensuring that there's alignment between the compensation and the company's strategy and performance. So I think it all starts with sort of the basic tenets, but as I've heard you mention and has been mentioned on your show a number of times, the compensation committee is like the new audit committee. And I do think that there are some specialized skills that, while not necessarily have been high on the list to date, I do think they're going to be much more important going forward. And those are clearly things like, you know, compensation-specific experience, human resources experience, and experience with corporate governance-related matters. These are all, I think, very critical. And I think as we look ahead, much like the specific experience and some of that specific criteria that boards are looking for from a financial expert on the audit committee, we're going to start looking for more of that experience and expertise from the comp committee chair.
And that's where the matrix comes in.
Sure.
Important when somebody's looking, they got to make sure that they have somebody in there either for the normal rotation of a committee chair, or the unlikely case that something happens and they have a succession. So that leads us to another question, which is the rotation of committee chairs or the rotation of the comp chair. Let me start with your views and then I'll build on top of that.
Well, TK, I do have a number of my clients that will have some established guidelines for the frequency that the board committees will look to reevaluate and perhaps, you know, reapprove a board committee chair. It's not uncommon for that to occur, for example, every 3 years for them to look at that. And I do think it's a good thing that, that there's at least some guideline that prompts this kind of review and discussion to assess the, the appropriateness of leadership and the functioning of the committee itself. And I do think periodically it's good to have some refresh, just so we have a new perspective on the committee. But I do think that, my own point of view is 3 years for an actual change or an actual rotation is too frequent. And I do think you need some more tenure and longevity in the role, and I'll give you a few reasons why. I think number one, executive compensation today is becoming increasingly complex. And an effective compensation committee chair really needs to know the ins and outs, not only of the company's compensation programs, particularly the incentive programs, but also the dynamics that are happening externally that are influencing the design and implementation of executive compensation. So things like peer group and market trends, regulatory and legislative developments, and of course, our friends and changes with the proxy advisors. Secondly, I think that if you look at the construction of CEO and executive compensation today, you'll find that a significant portion of that is dedicated toward long-term performance, and so there's the establishment of long-term performance metrics, often looking at a 3-year time horizon. It takes a little bit of time for a committee chair to see some of those cycles come to fruition to really be able to take a perspective of whether or not there is some good alignment with incentive programs and company performance outcomes. And the last reason I think it's good to have perhaps some less frequent transition in the rotation will be, building long-lasting relationships. It's important for a committee chair to build and maintain strong relationships with management and the outside advisor to ensure that there's a lot of trust in the process. One of the things that you mentioned earlier in the program, and it's come up a lot frequently, is the importance of shareholder dialogue with the comp committee chair. That's happening with increased frequency, and I think, it's important to have some longevity in those relationships as well.
So we've identified the people on the front end. We've got our rotation in place. Now it's time to rotate out and the all-important transition, okay?
Yeah.
So how about giving us the keys, the important keys to what has to occur for best practice in transition of the comp chair?
Well, TK, I think with any kind of transition, whether it's a board committee chair or other board succession or a CEO transition, I think the key elements are upfront defining the objectives and also identifying roles and responsibilities for the transition. And when it comes to the objectives for a successful committee chair transition, I think it really boils down to two things: informing and listening. And then when it comes down to the roles, we get into, I think, very important roles with the outgoing committee chair, key members of senior management, and the outside advisor. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of those roles and talk about informing and listening throughout. If we start with the outgoing chair, I think obviously there's going to be a lot of conversations that will be happening between the outgoing chair and the incoming chair between meetings, in terms of the outgoing chair really providing maybe some tips to success, how to run an effective meeting, maybe how to manage some relationships between management and the outside advisor. TK, one example that I've seen is particularly effective is having a few meetings where you can kind of get the incoming committee chair's feet wet with the process. So, for example, that might mean starting to include the incoming chair in pre-meeting discussions with the chair and management, the outside advisor, maybe even having a meeting where the chair hasn't fully rotated off yet, but we have an opportunity for the incoming chair to sort of play the role of acting chair in the meeting. I think that's really essential in sort of integrating and starting to get, again, the incoming chair's feet wet throughout the process. If we transition into the roles of management in the process, I think that there are about at least three aspects that I think that they play from an informing perspective. Number one, I think, is just providing some good education on the committee calendar and the committee agenda, as well as the charter, making sure that we're all clear on what that is, what the timing and sequence of pay decisions are throughout the year. Number two is good, robust conversation and education around the ins and outs of the programs, not just how they work now, but the history. What was the philosophy when they were developed at the time? And then number three, I think it's informing and educating the chair about who's responsible for what in terms of development of materials. And that might include, TK, some introduction to some folks in the compensation department, the legal department, and maybe the HR department that the committee chair has not yet, been introduced to before. They may be playing an important role in the process. If you move then finally to the outside advisor, what role do they play? I think it's important to have some dialogue around the engagement between the outside advisor and the compensation committee, reporting back on the engagement documentation, the independence documentation, perhaps providing an opportunity to offer some, and reinforce, I should say, some points of view about the compensation programs. And then again, providing education and some informing what's happening externally, proxy advisors, what's kind of coming down the road. So I think, from an informing perspective, I think, again, each one of those parties has a very important responsibility. A couple ways I've seen this handled very well, TK, is when company management just sets a date where the incoming chair, the outgoing chair, management, and the consultant are all together at a day-long meeting at the company to kind of go through all of these topics together. And to have some one-on-one time between the incoming chair and management, and some one-on-one time with the incoming chair and the compensation consultant to really kind of start things off on the right foot. But if I transition over now to the second objective that I mentioned before about listening, this is absolutely critical. And I think that there are some tactical elements, when it comes to listening. So gaining a perspective from the incoming chair on their perspective on detail. How much detail do they like to see? How often do they want to have discussions and meetings, and in what format? What kind of communication do they like? Email, phone calls, in person? How often or how much in advance of the meetings do they want to see materials? I think those are some of the very basic tactical elements, but I think far more important are some strategic elements, which is understanding their philosophy and perspective on executive compensation. What is their view of the world? Keep in mind, TK, that it's not uncommon for a sitting board member to be serving on other boards, perhaps other compensation committee. Maybe the incoming chair is a former executive of a company. So they'll be bringing in some predispositions and some thoughts around compensation from the start. I think it's just very important from the outset to really understand that.
Well, that's good, and it's certainly great advice. I would say that corporate secretary and the chief human resource officer are pretty key in that process. But Michael, great analysis of what board needs to do to make sure that comp chair is all set up, and I appreciate you taking the time and joining us. Before we close, I just want to make another key announcement. Meridian Compensation Partners will be holding a complimentary webinar titled Looking Ahead to 2017 Executive Compensation Under a New Administration. This is going to be September 15th at 2 o'clock on Eastern Standard Time. I don't know if Meridian has some crystal ball into who is going to win that particular election, but I think it's going to be interesting nonetheless. You can register at the Meridian website, which is www.meridiancp.com, or you can go to Boardroom Resources website. We also have a box there that you can click on. So that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.